Hello, this is Dr. Michael Labasi, your professor for Pen Test or CIS 2642, and this is a review of Week 1 or Topic 1, which is about pen testing in general. So we're going to cover from the textbook, at least at the time of this recording, is the CompTIA Pen Test Plus Survey Guide, and we'll cover Chapter 1 on pen testing. Now, I'm not going to read the textbook to you, of course. We'll look at the summary maybe to make sure I didn't miss anything. But we will look at the slide deck, and actually, as a side note, usually slide decks with textbooks are really bad. This one's actually really well. It's not very long, and it has some really good points. So I know you're don't despair with a PowerPoint slide here. So in any case, we're looking at pen testing in general, and before we even look at pen testing, we look at what are the goals of cybersecurity. Of course, the three pillars: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And if we look at that, you can see where we want to come in and find ways to either do disclosure, we can alter the system, or can we do denial for availability. Honestly, when it comes to most pen testing, this one is something you don't do too much of. You don't do too much DDoS testing. But you can check to see that various tools are in place that might help mitigate availability hit impacts. Most of the time, though, you actually really work around those tools. So like FireEye, for example, you might need to work around that, or some sort of web app firewall. But this definitely is one: confidentiality, disclosure, and alteration of integrity of data. So probably the biggest one is going to be this one: confidentiality or disclosure. We know this as, of course, is our data breach. So databases are definitely going to be one of your targets. And every engagement might change based upon the contract, the statement of work. Now that's actually next chapter, so I'm not going to talk about it here. But just keep that in mind. Every engagement is different. So again, as we go through, anytime you approach this, so you need to think like your adversary. You need to be the attacker. Discover a single exploited vulnerability. That's definitely a good one. True is that the attacker only needs to win once, defender has to win every time. So one thing is you adapt this hacker mindset, is to also realize though that you need to have some stuff in place to make sure you can come back and help your client shore up their defenses on what you're based on your findings. So just finding a way to exploit a system is great. If you can find other assets to help bring to the client and show how they can shore it up or fix it, and we'll discuss this throughout the course. I know if you've had other courses before, you've heard the term OWASP. That's a big one I like to use. Things like best practices, things like that. So, but yeah, definitely 90% is that adversarial thinking. But also keep in mind, though, there is some percentage of mindset we need to think like you're still a business person. There's going to be rules of engagement, things like that. We'll look at again into the next chapter, pen test contracts. So again, there is a benefit though. Definitely benefits of pen testing we've seen, which of course is the fact that the best way to see if something is secure is to attack it. So you might be actually be an internal employee bringing to bear a pen test against an internal system. You might be a contracted employee doing this with a third party. And also there's the various levels of pen testing we'll look at too, and that it could be, I think, from a vulnerability scan. It could be a very light check of a system. It could be a mobile app. It could be an API test. So again, every contract's different, but all of them should bring some benefits to help shore up defense. That's really the biggest thing, is find those vulnerabilities before someone else does. And also there could be other things behind that too. If you are pen testing and there are certain requirements, PCI for example is a big one, HIPAA, then you get a little homework to do. Make sure you realize how that might affect your pen test. And of course you might work in teams. You might work in a red team, usually referred to as a red team. You could be working on a blue team, which is not only pen testing, more defense, but still, I think as being a defender, you need to think like the attacker, how they might approach your system. So that both sides of the house you might find yourself in. Now let's talk about the process of pen testing here. So planning and scoping, definitely important, and we're going to talk about that mouse at. Plan and scoping, a huge deal here. This is very important, and this is a little bit of chapter 2. You can see here, look at pen tests. You just don't really nilly just run in and start hacking everything. Unless, of course, that's a scope of test. Scoping is very important. And again, I don't want to get into chapter 2, but understanding what you can test and where your boundaries are. And it's going to help you plan. So, and the next phase, of course, is information gathering and vulnerability. This is probably the biggest one. This is if you return to as recon. So, information gathering is huge. The more time you spend there, I do believe, the more success you have at that. So, I mean, if you were to look at, graph it out here, time in recon, and then the vulnerabilities found. I do believe that now it's not always going to be a straight this way. Chances are it will actually there'll be a point where recon does stop paying off. But at first, recon is really going to be great. After a while, you will probably cap out and end up just into analysis paralysis. And it should fade out like this. Now, again, this is my experience. This is nothing in the textbook. But there's a point where recon does become probably at its best, and you start finding the best vulnerabilities over a certain amount of time. Now, here's, of course, the constraint, time. You only have so much, so you can't go on forever. If you could, you might actually start to swing this back up. The longer you can take watching your target, watching their activities, both physical and on the web, network traffic, doing Google searches, dark web searches on them, things like that. You will probably find more and more over time, but this is really a constraint that we deal with as a pen tester. You only have so much time. So it's the best way to make use of that time to get this box here, get in that little box of finding the best stuff and with the best tools. And that's, again, going back to scoping and planning. So ensuring that you really understand how you're going to approach your target. Now I'm going to get into something here. It's called the Zen of pen testing. That's a different topic. I'll actually post that here in a bit because you're going to find yourself on some shaky ground. And so I'll leave that for the other video. For now, we'll focus back on the chapter, and we'll come back. So now, of course, after you find some vulnerabilities, you try to attack or exploit the vulnerability. And this is where multiple tools might come in handy. You might have multiple tools showing the same exploit or the same vulnerability. That's good. But there's times you might not be able to even pull the exploit off. Does not mean that it is something that is bad. It's just because you can't get the exploit to fire off does not mean it's not there. Again, you're dealing with an amount of time. And at the end of course, is reporting and communicating your results, your pen test report. So very important process there. Now, before we go into this next slide here, this whole thing being linear, I wouldn't really put it that way. You might find yourself doing a lot of loops here. Back exploit, back to vulnerability, even coming back from communicating results and going back and revalidating something. Even planning a scope, and you might say, was this in our scope? It might be in our scope. We don't understand that. Our plan now we don't understand the scope of this one system that we originally looked at. And it could depend, of course, on your approach of the test. So the test approach, is it a black box test? Black box being, here's our company, here's our website, come at us. Total red team, you might have full reign for social engineering attacks, but you might find yourself into a gray box or white box test. It could be a mobile app, and maybe you have you're given logins for both admin and regular user, and maybe you have some documentation to look at. It could be development documentation. It could be even the source code. So that's going to change how you test. So it could be maybe initially in your planning as a black box test, and your planning you didn't realize how much information gathering was needed. So that might come back and have you go back and revisit that process. So again, the slide shows it linear. I do believe it's this, and this is something I have on my own page. It's stickerheist.com. There's a lot of go backs. There's a lot of stuff here. Always, you might be vulnerability scanning, you go back to recon. And we've heard this as pivoting. You might actually get into the pivoting phase where you end up going back into reconnaissance after you get some foothold. It could be an initial system, it could be some of the desktop. So this phase right here, get the marker out, this phase right here, I believe is probably one of the biggest ones you'll go back to. And then exploiting and vulnerability scanning, you might have to go back and rescan. You might have the exact exploit you think you have. And even then, if you have an exploit, you kick it off, you're back into recon. Because maybe you did get a foothold, maybe you did get a remote shell. But it's not the system that you want to get in. You want to go further into the target. And all this time too, looting, you might find some loot that will actually give you more information to recon. It could be a password, it could be a username password you've discovered. It has you on another system, back into recon. So it's this process. When I do the presentation on the Zen pen testing here, we'll talk about that in more detail. That can be a little unsturdy, but I referred back to this here is more linear. I really think it's more cyclical process. It can be very chaotic too. So again, cyber kill chain. Lockheed Martin just came up with this, and everybody is with this. You come up with reconnaissance. For your discoveries, is there something you can weaponize? This is the exploitation phase here. In this exploitation phase, can I kick off the exploit? Can I make it work? If I can, I can deliver the exploit. Can I get it work? If so, then I can get some installation. Can I get some sort of remote shell? And then even better, can I get a command and control setup within my target? Other tools we might look at during this course is the MITRE attack chain, or MITRE attack. This is a huge one that's used. It has reconnaissance. Again, it has a sort of a flow here, impact, exfiltration, and so on. Some of these things here might actually help you get information, like gathering victim information. They give you tips and tricks, references you can use, and so on. We'll come back to this later, so we might refer to the MITRE attack. You can see there's some mapping here between the textbook does between the kill chain and pen testing. So go and review that. I won't do that here. You can do that in your reading. But tools, definitely going to be tool heavy. Probably the biggest ones going to be scanning tools. Another one is the OS IT framework. There's actually a website for that. And this is a great way to look at. And we'll come back to this again in other videos, probably more detail. But maybe if I could use social networks, can I go and use LinkedIn? And there are other tools I can use. Is there a LinkedIn script? Now, not all these things might work. Let's see. This one looks like it works. So there could be some tools you try to use that don't no longer work. And that's the problem with a lot of tools. They have a life of their own. They have their own bugs. But this is a great place you might be able to find tools to help you focus your attack. So, and of course, open source information framework here, the OSINT. Is fantastic. So, usernames, how you going to look for usernames, username searches, username checks. There you go. So look at this. So this is a resource that we will definitely look at further on. Again, I don't want to go to it yet because we will be looking at information gathering. You can see here specifically on weeks 3 and 4. 2 big weeks there. So I don't want to get too deep down that yet, but realize there are tools for that, mobile tools, web proxies. But this is the time, though, early on when you look at your scope of work and your rules of engagement, it might dictate what kind of tools you might be using. If I can't do any kind of DDoS attacks, which is very common in my experience, I don't get a lot of DDoS attacks. No sense in me exploring DDoS tools, because I'm not going to be able to use those in my engagement. Some tools might not be the best tools. That's a problem. And then we'll talk about that again. You'll see that into Zen pen testing. We'll talk about tool overuse. So that's the end of the slideshow. Again, and we'll look at. I'll close that up here, and we'll look at the textbook itself. Again, the textbook summarizes basically what I did here, we're looking at adapting to a hacker mindset, probably the biggest part. Go away. There we go. Adapting to hacker mindset. Let's use it just as highlighting. Think like the attacker. Helps you focus in. It's going to help you with planning, especially information gathering and vulnerability identification, and so on. So realize there's a process you're going to bring to bear. It can be different each engagement, but that's going to help you work with that. So again, I will post my thoughts on the Zen pen testing here. I'll probably do it next. And I say watch that one. It shouldn't be very long, but it's going to help you realize when you go through this course, you're going to be doing a live attack against a HackerOne target you're going to choose. You can do that along with online labs. Labs are going to be great for you to learn these tools, but your live target is going to be where you're going to sort of employ these tools, and you find yourself on some shaky ground. So I will suggest please watch the Zen pen testing and give you some idea about how to shore up your process and become a good pen tester. So that is the end of the show. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.